In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of royal tradition echo through marble halls, a single envelope marked with the German federal eagle arrived on a crisp October morning in 2015. Inside, an invitation that would spark the most emotionally charged and historically significant royal visit of the 21st century. This wasn't just another diplomatic ceremony. This was the moment when an 89-year-old queen would confront the ghosts of World War II, stand before the children of former enemies, and prove that forgiveness can triumph over the darkest chapters of history. What happened during those 4 days in Germany would forever change how the world viewed reconciliation, courage, and the true power of monarchy in modern times. The woman who had witnessed the Blitz as a teenager, who had served her country through the Cold War, and who had spent 7 decades building bridges across a divided world, was about to embark on her most important diplomatic mission yet. But nobody, not even Her Majesty herself, could have predicted the extraordinary events that would unfold, the tears that would be shed, or the moment when protocol would be abandoned for something far more powerful than royal tradition. This is the true story of how Queen Elizabeth II's fifth state visit to Germany became a masterpiece of human connection, political breakthrough, and personal triumph that resonates to this day. The autumn leaves were falling like golden confetti outside the windows of Windsor Castle when Sir Christopher Guy, the Queen's private secretary, knocked softly on the door of the Queen's private study. Inside, Her Majesty was reviewing correspondence with her usual morning tea, the familiar ritual that had anchored her days for more than 6 decades on the throne. "Your Majesty," Sir Christopher began, his voice carrying an unusual note of significance. "President Gauck has extended a formal invitation for a state visit to Germany. This would be your 5th official visit to the Federal Republic." The Queen looked up from her papers, her blue eyes reflecting decades of diplomatic experience. Germany. The word carried weight that few others could understand. She had been a young princess during the war, watching London burn from the windows of Buckingham Palace. Yet she had also witnessed the remarkable transformation of former enemies into trusted allies. "The timing is quite significant," Sir Christopher continued, settling into the chair across from her desk. "This year marks the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. President Gauck has specifically requested that the visit include a ceremony at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. The Queen set down her teacup with the deliberate care that characterized all her movements. Bergen-Belsen. The name alone evoked memories of grainy black and white photographs, of liberation footage that had shocked the world, of humanity's darkest hour laid bare. "No British monarch has ever visited a former Nazi concentration camp," she said quietly, her voice carrying the measured tone that had guided the nation through countless crises. "Indeed, Your Majesty, it would be unprecedented." The Queen rose from her desk and walked to the window, gazing out at the sprawling grounds where she had played as a child, where she had learned to drive army trucks during the war, where she had raised her own children. The weight of history seemed to press against the ancient stones of the castle. In Berlin, President Joachim Gauck was having his own moment of reflection in the presidential palace. A former pastor and civil rights activist who had lived through both Nazi tyranny and communist oppression, he understood the profound symbolism of what he was proposing. His advisors had spent weeks debating whether to include Bergen-Belsen in the itinerary. Her president, his chief of staff, had warned, "This is enormously sensitive. There are still those who believe such visits serve no purpose, who think we should move beyond the past." Gauck had stood firm. "The past is not something we move beyond," he had replied. "It is something we carry forward responsibly." The Queen's presence at Bergen-Belsen would demonstrate that remembrance and reconciliation can coexist. The invitation had been crafted with extraordinary care. Every word had been weighed, every nuance considered. The German Foreign Ministry had worked closely with the British Embassy to ensure the proposal struck the right balance between honoring the victims of the Holocaust and celebrating the remarkable friendship that had emerged from the ashes of war. Back at Windsor Castle, the Queen was surrounded by her closest advisors. Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond had driven down from London specifically for this meeting, understanding the gravity of the decision before them. "The political implications are substantial, Your Majesty," Hammond explained, spreading out briefing papers across the polished table. "Your visit would coincide with challenging times for European unity. The refugee crisis, economic pressures, rising nationalism in several countries. Your presence in Germany would send a powerful message about British-German friendship and European stability." Sir Christopher nodded in agreement. "The symbolism would be particularly potent given the current climate. At a time when some are questioning the value of international cooperation, your visit would demonstrate the benefits of reconciliation and partnership." The Queen listened intently, her fingers drumming lightly against the table in a rhythm known only to those who had served her for years. She was thinking not just as a monarch, but as someone who had lived through the transformation of Europe from a continent torn apart by war to one united in peace and prosperity. "What do we know about the specific arrangements they're proposing?" she asked. Sir Christopher consulted his notes. The visit would span 4 days. Berlin for the official ceremonies and political meetings, then Frankfurt for economic and cultural events, and finally Bergen-Belsen in Lower Saxony. They've proposed a private moment of reflection at the memorial, followed by a meeting with survivors and their families. The last detail hung in the air with particular significance. Meeting Holocaust survivors wasn't just a diplomatic gesture. It was a deeply personal encounter with living history. These were individuals who had experienced unimaginable suffering, whose lives had been forever changed by events that occurred when she was still a teenage princess. Prince Philip, who had been quietly listening from his chair near the fireplace, spoke for the first time. "The Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme has been operating in Germany for over 30 years, he said in his characteristically direct manner. "I've met thousands of young Germans through those programs. Bright, thoughtful, committed to building a better world. They deserve to know that we judge them on who they are, not on what happened before they were born." The Queen appreciated her husband's perspective. Philip had his own complex relationship with Germany. Born into the Greek royal family, with strong German connections, he had served in the Royal Navy during the war, fighting against German forces while maintaining family ties across enemy lines. His journey from potential adversary to devoted consort had paralleled the broader transformation of British-German relations. The discussion continued for over 2 hours, touching on security concerns, protocol questions, and the intricate choreography required for a successful state visit. The Queen's protection officers would need to coordinate with German security forces. The royal household would work with German officials to ensure every detail met both countries' expectations. But beyond the logistics lay deeper questions. How should a British monarch approach the site of a Nazi concentration camp? What words could possibly be appropriate? How could she honor the victims while acknowledging the remarkable journey toward reconciliation? The Queen requested time to consider the invitation personally. That evening, she dined alone in her private apartments, the familiar surroundings providing comfort as she wrestled with one of the most significant decisions of her reign. The walls around her held portraits of her predecessors, monarchs who had guided Britain through wars and peace, triumph, and tragedy. She thought about her own war experiences, the nights spent in the underground shelters during the Blitz, the anxiety of not knowing whether family members serving in the military would return safely. She remembered the joy of V-Day, the celebrations in the streets, but also the gradual realization of the full horror of what had been perpetrated in Nazi concentration camps. Over the years, she had met numerous Holocaust survivors at various events. Their stories had moved her deeply, their resilience had inspired her, their forgiveness had amazed her. Many had told her how much it meant to them that Britain had provided refuge for those who escaped, that British forces had helped liberate the camps, that Britain had played a crucial role in ensuring such atrocities never happened again. The Queen also considered the contemporary context. Europe was facing its biggest refugee crisis since World War II, with millions fleeing conflict and persecution in the Middle East and Africa. Some politicians were exploiting fears and prejudices using language that echoed darker periods in European history. Her visit to Bergen-Belsen could serve as a powerful reminder of where hatred and intolerance ultimately lead. The next morning brought a call from Chancellor Angela Merkel herself. The German leader, who had developed a warm working relationship with the Queen over many years, personally endorsed President Gauck's invitation. "Your Majesty," Merkel said through the secure telephone line, "your presence would mean more to the German people than I can adequately express. We have come so far together, Britain and Germany, from the darkness of war to the light of partnership. Your visit would celebrate that journey while honoring those we lost along the way." The Chancellor's words carried special weight. Merkel had grown up in East Germany, behind the Iron Curtain, where the full story of the Holocaust had been suppressed by communist authorities. Since reunification, Germany had worked tirelessly to confront its past honestly and comprehensively. The Queen's visit would acknowledge and validate those efforts. Later that morning, the Queen met with the chief rabbi, Ephraim Mirvis, who had been consulted about the proposed visit to Bergen-Belsen. His support was unequivocal. "Your Majesty's presence at Bergen-Belsen will be profoundly meaningful to Jewish communities worldwide," he explained. "It would demonstrate that the memory of the Holocaust remains alive in the highest levels of British society, that the lessons of that dark period continue to guide our actions today." The rabbi shared stories of Holocaust survivors living in Britain, many of whom had expressed hope that the Queen might one day visit a former concentration camp. For them, your presence would represent validation of their suffering and recognition of their survival, he said. By afternoon, the Queen had made her decision. She called Sir Christopher to her study and delivered the news with the quiet dignity that had characterized her entire reign. "Please inform President Gauck that I accept his invitation with gratitude and solemnity," she said. "We shall go to Germany, and we shall go to Bergen-Belsen." The announcement would not be made public for several days, allowing time for detailed planning to begin. But within the private circles of the royal household and the German government, preparations immediately shifted into high gear. In Berlin, President Gauck received the news with a mixture of joy and profound responsibility. He understood that the Queen's agreement to visit Bergen-Belsen represented more than diplomatic courtesy. It was an act of moral leadership that would resonate far beyond the borders of either country. The planning for the visit would involve dozens of officials from both countries, security experts, protocol specialists, and historians. Every detail would be scrutinized, every moment carefully choreographed. But at its heart, the visit would be about something much simpler and more powerful: the triumph of human dignity over human evil, the victory of reconciliation over revenge, and the enduring strength of bonds forged in the commitment to never forget the past while building a better future. As news of the Queen's decision began to circulate quietly through diplomatic channels, preparations began for what would become one of the most significant royal visits in modern history. The stage was set for a journey that would touch hearts, challenge assumptions, and demonstrate the continued relevance of monarchy in addressing humanity's greatest moral challenges. The Queen's fifth state visit to Germany would be unlike any that had come before. The basement conference room beneath the German presidential palace had been transformed into a command center unlike anything seen before in diplomatic planning. Maps covered the walls, security assessments lay spread across tables, and dozens of officials from multiple agencies worked around the clock to coordinate what was being called the most complex state visit in German history. Klaus Weber, the protocol chief for the German Foreign Ministry, had been planning state visits for over 20 years, but nothing had prepared him for this challenge. "Every decision we make carries historical weight," he told his team during their daily morning briefing. "This isn't just about diplomatic ceremony. We are creating moments that will be remembered for generations." The visit was still 6 months away, but already the attention to detail was extraordinary. The Queen's visit to Bergen-Belsen would be the centerpiece of the trip, but it was also the most sensitive element. Working with the Bergen-Belsen Memorial Foundation, German officials were designing an experience that would honor the victims, respect the survivors, and acknowledged the profound significance of a British monarch visiting the site. Dr. Jens Christian Wagner, director of the Memorial Foundation, had been consulted extensively about the visit. "We must strike the right balance," he explained to the planning committee. "The Queen's presence here is historic, but it cannot overshadow the primary purpose of this place, to remember the victims and educate future generations." The memorial site itself would require modifications to accommodate the royal visit while maintaining its somber dignity. Security assessments had to be balanced against the need for meaningful engagement. Every pathway would be examined, every sight line considered, every moment planned with military precision while preserving the emotional authenticity of the experience. Meanwhile, in London, the royal household was conducting its own intensive preparations. The Queen's dresser, Angela Kelly, was working with German cultural experts to ensure Her Majesty's wardrobe would be appropriate for each occasion. For Bergen-Belsen, they had chosen a simple black coat and hat, elegant but understated, designed to show respect without drawing attention away from the memorial's purpose. Sir Christopher Geit had assembled a team of historians, diplomats, and Jewish community leaders to brief the Queen on every aspect of the camp's history. She would need to understand not just the basic facts, but the personal stories, the individual tragedies, and the remarkable tales of survival that gave human meaning to the statistics. Rabbi Julia Neuberger, a prominent British Jewish leader, was among those consulted for the preparations. Her Majesty has always shown deep sensitivity to Jewish history and suffering, she observed during one planning session. But visiting Bergen-Belsen will require a different level of emotional preparation. This is sacred ground where thousands died and where the full horror of the Holocaust became clear to the world. The Queen herself was reading extensively about the camp's history. She studied testimonies from British soldiers who had liberated Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, accounts that described conditions so horrific they had shocked even battle-hardened veterans. She read survivor memoirs, historical analyses, and contemporary accounts from journalists who had accompanied the liberation forces. One account particularly moved her: the story of Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin, a British officer who had been among the first to enter the camp. His description of the inmates' gratitude, despite their unimaginable suffering, had stayed with her for days. The inmates had lost faith in everything except the humanity of the individual, he had written. But they had never lost faith in Britain. Prince Philip, meanwhile, was preparing for his own role in the visit. At 94, he would be accompanying the Queen throughout the German tour, including to Bergen-Belsen. His private secretary had been coordinating with historians about his family's complex German connections, ensuring that any questions about his background could be addressed sensitively and honestly. The Duke of Edinburgh had his own memories of the war's aftermath. As a young naval officer, he had heard first-hand accounts from colleagues who had participated in the liberation of various concentration camps. The stories had profoundly affected him, contributing to his lifelong commitment to interfaith dialogue and his support for Holocaust education. Back in Germany, the media attention was already building. Newspapers across Europe were describing the upcoming visit as historic, groundbreaking, unprecedented. Jewish organizations were expressing gratitude for the Queen's willingness to visit Bergen-Belsen, while Holocaust survivors were sharing their emotions about the approaching royal tribute. Anita Lasker-Wallfish, a Bergen-Belsen survivor living in London, had been invited to meet the Queen during the visit. At 90 years old, she would represent thousands of others who had suffered in the camp. "I never thought I would live to see a British Queen visit the place where I nearly died," she told reporters. "It means the world to know that the suffering has not been forgotten." The German government was also using the visit to highlight contemporary issues. Chancellor Merkel had requested that the itinerary include meetings with Syrian refugees, drawing parallels between past and present humanitarian crises. The message would be subtle but clear. The lessons of the Holocaust remained relevant in addressing modern challenges of displacement and persecution. Security preparations were unprecedented in their scope. The Queen's protection officers were working with German federal police, local authorities, and international security agencies. Counterterrorism experts were conducting threat assessments, while crowd control specialists were planning for the thousands of people expected to line the streets during the royal procession. For Bergen-Belsen specifically, the security challenges were unique. The memorial site was not designed to accommodate large crowds or extensive security apparatus. Special arrangements had to be made to ensure protection without compromising the dignity of the memorial or interfering with its primary function as a place of remembrance. The Queen's private secretary was also coordinating with Lambeth Palace, ensuring that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, could participate in certain ceremonial aspects of the visit. Archbishop Welby's presence would add another layer of significance, representing not just the Church of England, but the broader Christian response to the Holocaust. Educational aspects were being carefully planned as well. The Queen would meet with young Germans and British students who were participating in exchange programs designed to promote understanding and prevent the repetition of historical atrocities. These encounters were seen as crucial for connecting the visit's historical significance to its contemporary relevance. Dr. Andrea Despot, who directed educational programs at Bergen-Belsen, was working with British educators to arrange for students from both countries to witness the Queen's visit. Young people need to understand that remembrance is not just about the past, she explained. It's about taking responsibility for the future. The Queen's speechwriters were facing perhaps their greatest challenge. What words could adequately acknowledge the horror of the Holocaust while honoring the victims and celebrating the reconciliation that have followed? The speech for Bergen-Belsen would be one of the most scrutinized and significant addresses of her reign. Drafts were being reviewed by historians, Holocaust survivors, Jewish leaders, German officials, and members of the royal family. Every phrase was examined for accuracy, sensitivity, and appropriate tone. The Queen herself was intimately involved in the writing process, insisting that the words reflect not just official sentiment, but genuine emotion. Meanwhile, logistical preparations continued around the clock. The royal aircraft would need to coordinate with German air traffic control. Ground transportation had to be arranged for the Queen's extensive entourage. Hotels were being secured, menus planned, security swept, and backup arrangements prepared for every possible contingency. The German people themselves were preparing for the visit with remarkable enthusiasm. Opinion polls showed overwhelming support for the Queen's journey to Bergen-Belsen, with many Germans expressing gratitude that she was willing to confront this difficult aspect of their history. Street decorations were being planned, school children were learning about British-German relations, and local officials were preparing for what many saw as the most important diplomatic event of their careers. British expatriates living in Germany were organizing their own celebrations of the Queen's visit. The British ambassador to Germany, Sir Sebastian Wood, was coordinating with British community groups to ensure they could participate meaningfully in the royal tour. Many expressed pride that their queen was leading by example in confronting difficult historical truths. The royal wardrobe team was working on every detail of the Queen's appearance throughout the 4-day visit. Beyond the black outfit for Bergen-Belsen, they were preparing elegant ensembles for state dinners, casual attire for walkabouts, and formal dress for ceremonial occasions. Each outfit would carry symbolic significance, from colors that honored both British and German traditions to jewelry that reflected the solemnity or celebration of each event. Photography and media arrangements required their own extensive planning. The Queen's visit to Bergen-Belsen would be one of the most photographed moments of her reign, and officials wanted to ensure the images would serve the cause of remembrance rather than sensationalism. Specific locations were designated for photographers, angles were chosen to maintain dignity, and strict guidelines were established for media coverage. As the months passed and the visit drew closer, the excitement and anticipation continued to build. Historians were already describing the upcoming trip as potentially the most significant royal visit since the Queen's coronation tour of the Commonwealth in the 1950s. The symbolic power of the British monarch visiting a Nazi concentration camp was recognized as unprecedented and profoundly meaningful. Holocaust survivors across the world were expressing their emotions about the approaching visit. Many saw it as validation of their suffering, recognition of their survival, and commitment to ensuring the memory of the Holocaust would be preserved for future generations. The Queen's presence at Bergen-Belsen would represent not just British acknowledgement of the tragedy, but international solidarity with all who had suffered under Nazi persecution. The final preparations were entering their critical phase. Every detail had been planned, every contingency considered, every word carefully chosen. But everyone involved understood that the most important elements of the visit could not be scripted. The emotional moments, the personal connections, and the profound impact of witnessing a monarch confront one of humanity's darkest chapters. The stage was set for a visit that would make history, touch hearts, and demonstrate the enduring power of reconciliation over hatred, remembrance over forgetting, and hope over despair. In just a few weeks, the Queen would embark on her fifth state visit to Germany, carrying with her the hopes of two nations and the responsibility of honoring the memory of those who have been lost to one of history's greatest tragedies. The morning of June 23, 2015, dawned crisp and clear over London as the final preparations for the Queen's departure to Germany reached their crescendo. At RAF Nordholt, the Royal aircraft gleamed in the early sunlight while ground crews conducted their final safety checks. Inside Buckingham Palace, the Queen was completing her morning routine with the calm precision that had characterized her approach to royal duties for more than 6 decades. Angela Kelly, her trusted dresser, was making final adjustments to the Queen's traveling outfit, an elegant powder blue coat, and matching hat that would be perfect for the arrival ceremony in Berlin. The color had been chosen deliberately. Blue represented both peace and hope, appropriate symbols for a visit focused on reconciliation and remembrance. As her dresser worked, the Queen reviewed her briefing papers one final time. The schedule for the 4-day visit was ambitious. Arrival ceremonies in Berlin, meetings with President Gauck and Chancellor Merkel, a state banquet, economic discussions in Frankfurt, cultural events, and then the historic visit to Bergen-Belsen on the final day. Each event carried its own significance, but everyone understood that the visit to the concentration camp memorial would be the emotional and historical centerpiece of the entire tour. Prince Philip joined his wife for a light breakfast, both maintaining their customary morning routine despite the magnitude of the journey ahead. At 94, the Duke of Edinburgh was still a vigorous traveler, though his staff had quietly made additional medical provisions for the trip. His presence beside the Queen throughout the visit would be particularly meaningful, given his own complex family history with Germany. Sir Christopher Geit arrived precisely at 9:30 a.m. for the final briefing before departure. The Queen's private secretary carried with him updates on security arrangements, weather forecasts, and last-minute protocol adjustments. German officials had reported enormous public interest in the visit, with crowds already gathering along the planned routes despite the royal couple not arriving until afternoon. "The German people are truly excited about this visit, Your Majesty," Sir Christopher reported. President Gauck mentioned that he's never seen such anticipation for any state visit during his presidency. The Queen nodded thoughtfully. She understood that this enthusiasm reflected more than typical curiosity about royal ceremony. For many Germans, particularly older generations who had lived through the war and its aftermath, her visit represented a profound gesture of forgiveness and friendship. For younger Germans, it demonstrated that reconciliation was possible even after the most terrible conflicts. The royal motorcade departed Buckingham Palace at 10:15 a.m., making its way through London toward RAF Nordholt. Even during the brief journey through the capital, people had gathered on street corners, waving British and German flags. Word of the Queen's departure had somehow spread, and Londoners wanted to show their support for what many recognized as a historic mission. At the airfield, a small ceremony marked the departure. The Lord Lieutenant of Greater London presented the Queen with flowers, while an honor guard from the Welsh Guards stood at attention. Brief speeches were exchanged, but the formal elements were kept to a minimum. Everyone understood the weight of the journey ahead and the need to maintain appropriate solemnity. The flight to Berlin took just over 2 hours, providing time for final preparations and quiet reflection. The Queen spent much of the journey reading testimonies from Holocaust survivors who would be meeting her at Bergen-Belsen. Each story was heartbreaking yet inspiring, demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. One account particularly moved her, the story of Gina Turgel, who had survived 3 concentration camps, including Bergen-Belsen. Gina had later married a British soldier who had helped liberate the camps, and their love story had become a symbol of hope emerging from darkness. Now in her 90s, Gina would be among those greeting the Queen at the memorial. As the royal aircraft began its descent toward Berlin, the Queen could see crowds gathering around Tegel Airport despite tight security restrictions. German television was providing live coverage of the arrival, with commentators describing the visit as the most significant royal tour in decades. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Exactly 70 years after the end of the war, the British monarch was returning to German soil not as a conqueror, but as a friend. The arrival ceremony at Tegel Airport was deliberately kept modest, respecting the serious nature of the visit's purpose. President Joachim Gauck and his partner Daniela Schatt waited at the foot of the aircraft steps, along with the British ambassador and senior German officials. A military band played both national anthems, the notes carrying across the tarmac with particular poignancy. President Gauck's greeting was warm but dignified. As a former pastor who had lived through both Nazi tyranny and communist oppression, he understood better than most the profound significance of this moment. His words of welcome spoke not just of diplomatic friendship, but of moral reconciliation. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying emotion that surprised even his staff. "Your presence here today represents the triumph of humanity over hatred, of reconciliation over revenge. The German people are deeply honored by your willingness to join us in remembering our shared history and celebrating our shared future." The Queen's response was equally moving. "President Gauck, it is my honor to return to Germany at this significant moment in our nation's relationship. We come together not to dwell on past sorrows, but to ensure that the lessons learned from those dark days continue to guide us toward a brighter future." The motorcade through Berlin provided the first glimpse of the extraordinary public response to the visit. Despite heavy security and cordoned streets, thousands of people had gathered at every possible vantage point. They waved British and German flags, held banners welcoming the Queen, and many carried flowers they hoped to present during the royal walkabouts planned for later in the visit. What struck observers most was the demographic diversity of the crowds. Elderly Germans who remembered the war stood alongside young families with children. Recent immigrants waved flags next to established Berlin residents, and Holocaust survivors had come to witness this historic moment of reconciliation. The gathering represented the new Germany that had emerged from the ashes of the old, diverse, democratic, and committed to confronting its past honestly. The Queen's first official engagement was a private meeting with President Gauck at Bellevue Palace, the official residence of the German head of state. The palace, built in 1786, had witnessed much of Germany's turbulent history, serving as a royal residence, government building, and symbol of the nation's democratic rebirth after the war. Their conversation lasted over an hour and covered topics ranging from European unity to refugee policy, from economic cooperation to environmental challenges. But both leaders understood that the elephant in the room was the upcoming visit to Bergen-Belsen. Neither wanted to discuss it extensively in advance, preferring to let the moment speak for itself. But both acknowledged the weight of responsibility they would carry together. "Your Majesty," President Gauck said as their meeting concluded, "tomorrow you will do something no British monarch has ever done. Your presence at Bergen-Belsen will speak louder than any diplomatic declaration about the power of forgiveness and the importance of memory." The Queen's response was characteristically measured but heartfelt. "President Gauck, we go to Bergen-Belsen not to reopen old wounds, but to ensure that the scars they left will serve as permanent reminders of why we must never allow such darkness to return. The evening's state banquet at Schloss Charlottenburg was magnificent in its formal splendor, but subdued in its emotional tone. The palace's Baroque grandeur provided an elegant backdrop for the dinner, but the speeches avoided triumphalism in favor of thoughtful reflection on the journey both nations had traveled together. Chancellor Angela Merkel, attending as head of government, spoke movingly about the transformation of German-British relations. 70 years ago, our nations were locked in mortal combat, she observed. Today, we stand together as partners in democracy, allies in freedom, and friends in the truest sense of the word. This transformation did not happen by accident. It required courage, forgiveness, and the determination to build something better from the ruins of the past. The Queen's response was one of her most personal speeches in years. She spoke about her own memories of the war, the anxiety of those dark days, but also about the hope she had witnessed in the decades that followed. I have had the privilege of watching enemies become friends, of seeing walls torn down rather than built up, of witnessing the power of human decency to overcome human cruelty. The banquet guests represented the full spectrum of German-British cooperation: politicians and diplomats, business leaders and academics, artists and scientists, Holocaust survivors and their descendants. The gathering itself demonstrated how completely the relationship between the two countries had been transformed. After dinner, the Queen had a private moment with several Holocaust survivors who would be accompanying her to Bergen-Belsen the following day. These conversations were not part of the official program, but the Queen had specifically requested them. She wanted to hear their stories personally, to understand their perspectives, and to ensure that her visit would honor their experiences appropriately. Anita Lasker-Wallfish, the Bergen-Belsen survivor who had been invited to meet the Queen, later described the encounter as one of the most moving moments of her life. Her Majesty listened to every word, she recalled. She asked thoughtful questions, she showed genuine emotion, and she made it clear that she understood the importance of what she would be doing tomorrow. As the evening concluded and the Queen retired to her suite at the Hotel Adlon, Berlin was settling in for what many recognized as a historic night. Tomorrow would bring the moment that everyone had been anticipating and preparing for: the visit to Bergen-Belsen. The concentration camp where tens of thousands had died, where British forces had witnessed unimaginable horror, where the full scope of Nazi evil had been revealed to the world. The Queen's staff conducted final preparations for the following day. Her black coat had been pressed and prepared, her speech had been rehearsed one final time, and security arrangements had been reviewed exhaustively. But everyone understood that the most important elements of tomorrow's visit could not be rehearsed or scripted. Outside the hotel, a small but steady stream of people continued to gather despite the late hour. Many carried flowers, others held candles, and some simply stood in silent vigil. They came from all walks of life: elderly Germans who remembered Liberation Day, young people who wanted to witness history, Jewish families whose relatives had perished in the camps, and ordinary citizens who understood they were living through a moment that would be remembered for generations. The media was preparing for extensive coverage of the Bergen-Belsen visit, with news organizations from around the world sending their most experienced correspondents to cover what many were calling the most significant royal event in decades. The images and words from tomorrow's ceremony would be transmitted instantly around the globe, carrying the message of remembrance and reconciliation to millions of viewers. In hotels and homes across Germany, people were making final preparations to witness history. Some had traveled hundreds of miles for the chance to see the Queen's motorcade pass by. Others had arranged to participate in related memorial services or educational events connected to the visit. The level of public engagement was unprecedented for any royal tour. As midnight approached and Berlin quieted down for the night, the significance of the coming day weighed heavily on everyone involved. Tomorrow, Queen Elizabeth II would become the first British monarch to visit a former Nazi concentration camp. She would stand where tens of thousands had suffered and died, where British soldiers had witnessed humanity at its worst, and where the world had learned lessons that must never be forgotten. The stage was set for a day that would make history, honor the dead, comfort the living, and demonstrate the extraordinary power of reconciliation in healing even the deepest wounds. In just a few hours, the Queen would embark on the most emotionally challenging and historically significant day of her reign, carrying with her the hopes of two nations and the responsibility of speaking for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The morning of June 26th arrived gray and somber, as if the weather itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. At the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, the Queen awakened to find the city unusually quiet, wrapped in the kind of respectful hush that precedes moments of profound historical significance. Outside her windows, she could see that crowds had been gathering since dawn, many holding flowers and wearing expressions of solemn anticipation. Angela Kelly had prepared the Queen's black ensemble with extraordinary care. The simple black coat and matching hat had been chosen months earlier, designed to convey respect and dignity while avoiding any hint of ostentation. A small diamond brooch, inherited from Queen Mary, provided the only ornamentation, its subtle sparkle serving as a reminder that even in the darkest places, light could still shine. The Queen's breakfast was subdued, shared quietly with Prince Philip as they both mentally prepared for what lay ahead. Neither spoke extensively about the coming visit to Bergen-Belsen, but their long marriage had taught them to communicate volumes through gestures and glances. The Duke reached across to briefly squeeze his wife's hand, a simple gesture that spoke of shared understanding and mutual support. Sir Christopher Geit arrived with final briefings and security updates. The route to Bergen-Belsen had been cleared and secured, but German police reported thousands of people lining the roadways despite the early morning hour. Many were Holocaust survivors and their families. Others were young Germans who wanted to witness this historic moment of remembrance. And still others were simply citizens who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The motorcade departure from Berlin was unlike any the Queen had experienced. Usually, royal tours featured celebratory crowds waving flags and cheering. Today, the people who had gathered stood in respectful silence, many with their hands over their hearts, some openly weeping. The contrast was profound and moving, a visible demonstration of how deeply the German people understood the significance of what their British guests were undertaking. During the 90-minute journey to Lower Saxony, the Queen reviewed once more the materials she had been studying for months. Photographs from the liberation of Bergen-Belsen in April 1945 remained as shocking today as they had been 70 years ago. British soldiers had found 60,000 prisoners, many barely alive, and thousands of unburied corpses. The images had shocked the world and provided undeniable evidence of Nazi atrocities. She also carried with her the stories of individual survivors who would be meeting her at the memorial. Each account was unique, yet all shared common themes of unimaginable suffering, remarkable resilience, and extraordinary courage. These were not just historical statistics. They were human beings who had endured hell and somehow found the strength to rebuild their lives. As the motorcade approached the Bergen-Belsen Memorial, the Queen could see the modest buildings and grounds that marked the site where so much suffering had occurred. The memorial had been designed with deliberate simplicity, avoiding anything that might detract from its primary purpose, to honor the victims and educate visitors about the horrors of the Holocaust. The arrival at Bergen-Belsen was marked by absolute silence. No bands played, no crowds cheered, no formal ceremonies welcomed the royal visitors. Instead, President Gauck, Chancellor Merkel, and memorial officials waited quietly near the entrance, their expressions reflecting the solemnity of the occasion. Even the media, present in large numbers, maintained respectful quiet as they documented this historic moment. Dr. Jens Christian Wagner, director of the Memorial Foundation, provided a brief orientation before the Queen's tour began. Speaking in hushed tones, he explained the layout of the site, the history of the camp, and the significance of the various memorial elements she would be visiting. His words were factual and direct, allowing the terrible history to speak for itself. The Queen's first stop was the Documentation Center, where she viewed exhibits detailing the camp's history from its establishment in 1940 through its liberation 5 years later. The displays included photographs, documents, and personal artifacts recovered from the site. Each item told a story of human suffering, but also of resistance, dignity, and hope maintained even in the darkest circumstances. One photograph particularly captured her attention: British soldiers helping survivors immediately after liberation. The image showed the remarkable humanity of the liberating forces, but also the terrible condition of those they had found. Many prisoners were so weak they could barely stand, yet their eyes showed gratitude for their rescue and determination to survive. Prince Philip, walking beside his wife, paused at a display showing the camp's British connections. Several members of his own extended family had been involved in post-war refugee assistance, and he had grown up hearing stories about the conditions discovered at various concentration camps. His presence at Bergen-Belsen represented his own journey of confronting this difficult history. The central moment of the visit came when the Queen walked to the memorial wall inscribed with the names of known victims. The wall stretched for several meters, covered with thousands of names representing only a fraction of those who had died at the camp. Many victims remained nameless, their identities lost along with their lives in the systematic machinery of genocide. Standing before the memorial wall, the Queen paused for several minutes in silent contemplation. The weight of history seemed to press down on the site, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves in the nearby trees. This was the moment that everyone had been anticipating, yet no one had been able to fully prepare for its emotional impact. When the Queen finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried across the memorial grounds with profound impact. We stand here today not to dwell on the darkness of the past, but to ensure that the light of memory continues to shine for future generations. These names represent not just statistics of suffering, but individual human beings whose lives were cut short by hatred and intolerance. The Queen then moved to meet with Holocaust survivors who had traveled to Bergen-Belsen for this unprecedented encounter. Among them was Gina Turgel, now 91 years old, who had survived multiple concentration camps, including Bergen-Belsen. Her story of survival and subsequent marriage to a British liberator had become legendary, but meeting the Queen brought new validation to her experiences. "Your Majesty," Gina said, tears streaming down her face, "I never thought I would live to see this day. Your presence here means that our suffering has not been forgotten, that the world still remembers what happened here." The Queen's response was equally emotional. Taking Gina's hands in her own, she spoke words that would be remembered by everyone present. "Mrs. Turgel, you and your fellow survivors represent the triumph of human dignity over human evil. Your courage in surviving and in sharing your stories ensures that the world will never forget the lessons of this place." Anita Lasker-Wallfish, the cellist who had survived Bergen-Belsen, shared her own memories with the Queen. She spoke of the power of music even in the midst of horror, how she had played in the women's orchestra at Auschwitz before being transferred to Bergen-Belsen. Her story illustrated how culture and humanity could persist even in the darkest circumstances. The Queen spent nearly an hour with the survivors, listening to each story with intense attention and responding with genuine emotion. These conversations were not part of the formal protocol, but they represented the heart of why she had come to Bergen-Belsen. These individuals embodied the human cost of hatred and the remarkable power of resilience. Chancellor Merkel, who had been deeply moved by the entire encounter, later described watching the Queen with the survivors as one of the most powerful moments she had witnessed in her political career. To see these elderly survivors finding comfort and validation in the presence of the British Queen was to witness reconciliation at its most profound level, she observed. The formal ceremony at the memorial included the laying of wreaths and the reading of the names of victims. The Queen's wreath bore a simple inscription, "In memory of all who suffered and died here, and in commitment to ensuring such darkness never returns." The words have been carefully chosen to honor the past, while acknowledging responsibility for the future. During the ceremony, a children's choir from a local German school sang a Hebrew memorial prayer. The young voices rising in the ancient language of remembrance provided a powerful symbol of how the lessons of the Holocaust were being passed to new generations. Many of the children were immigrants or children of immigrants, representing the new, diverse Germany that had emerged from the ashes of the old. The Queen's speech at Bergen-Belsen would be remembered as one of the most important addresses of her reign. Speaking without notes, she drew on months of preparation and decades of experience to deliver words that were both deeply personal and historically significant. "We gather at this place of memory," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the memorial grounds, "not to reopen old wounds, but to ensure that the scars they left serve as permanent reminders of our responsibility to one another. The evil that was perpetrated here was enabled by the silence of too many and the indifference of others. We must ensure that such silence and indifference never again allow hatred to flourish." She continued with words that would be quoted for years to come. "The survivors we have met today teach us that even in humanity's darkest hour, the human spirit can endure. Their courage in facing the unthinkable, their strength in rebuilding their lives, and their generosity in sharing their stories provide hope for all of us. They remind us that we each have a choice, to stand against hatred or to allow it to spread, to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, or to remain silent in the face of injustice." The Queen concluded her speech with a commitment that resonated far beyond Bergen-Belsen. "We leave this place changed by what we have seen and heard. We carry with us the responsibility to ensure that the memory of those who suffered and died here continues to guide us in building a world where such evil can never again take root." As the formal ceremony concluded, the Queen took a final walk through the memorial grounds, pausing at various points of significance. The memorial stones, the mass graves marked by simple monuments, the educational displays, each element contributed to the powerful narrative of remembrance and warning that Bergen-Belsen represented. The departure from Bergen-Belsen was as quiet as the arrival had been. The Queen paused at the memorial entrance to sign the visitor's book, writing simply, "In grateful memory of all who suffered here, and in commitment to ensuring their sacrifice was not in vain. Elizabeth R." The words were few, but their significance was immense. The journey back to Berlin was contemplative, with both the Queen and Prince Philip absorbing what they had experienced. The visit to Bergen-Belsen had been emotionally exhausting, but profoundly meaningful. They had witnessed firsthand the power of memory to educate, the importance of confronting difficult history, and the remarkable capacity of human beings to forgive and move forward while never forgetting. The impact of the Queen's visit to Bergen-Belsen was immediate and global. Television broadcasts carried images of the ceremony around the world. Newspapers devoted front pages to the historic visit, and social media buzzed with commentary about the significance of what had occurred. The message was clear: remembrance matters, reconciliation is possible, and moral leadership can come from unexpected places. As evening fell over Germany, the Queen and her entourage prepared for the final day of the state visit. But everyone understood that the visit to Bergen-Belsen had been the emotional and historical climax of the entire tour. What had occurred at the memorial would be remembered long after the diplomatic meetings and ceremonial events were forgotten. The Queen had done more than visit a historical site. She had participated in an act of remembrance that honored the victims, comforted the survivors, and demonstrated the power of moral leadership in confronting humanity's greatest challenges. The final day of the Queen's state visit to Germany dawned with a different atmosphere entirely. Where the previous day at Bergen-Belsen had been marked by solemnity and reflection, this morning carried an air of celebration and hope. The emotional journey through one of history's darkest chapters had led to a renewed appreciation for the light that had emerged from that darkness. The extraordinary friendship between Britain and Germany. The Queen's last official engagement would be in Frankfurt, Germany's financial capital, where she would address business leaders and young people about the future of European cooperation. But the shadow of Bergen-Belsen, or rather, the light that had emerged from that visit, would influence everything that followed. At breakfast in her Berlin hotel, the Queen was presented with letters and messages that had been arriving since news of her Bergen-Belsen visit had spread around the world. Holocaust survivors from dozens of countries had written to express their gratitude. Jewish organizations had issued statements praising her courage in confronting this difficult history. World leaders had sent messages acknowledging the significance of her gesture. One letter particularly moved her. It came from a group of German schoolchildren who had been studying the Holocaust and had watched coverage of her visit. Their teacher had helped them compose a message in English. Your Majesty, thank you for showing us that even the worst mistakes of the past can teach us to build a better future. We promise to remember what you taught us at Bergen-Belsen. Prince Philip, reviewing his own correspondence, found similar themes repeated again and again. The visit to Bergen-Belsen had resonated far beyond the immediate participants. It had struck a chord with people around the world who understood that confronting difficult history was essential for preventing its repetition. The journey to Frankfurt provided time for reflection on what had been accomplished. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Christopher Geidt, briefed her on the international response to the previous day's events. News organizations around the world had given prominent coverage to the Bergen-Belsen visit, with most commentators describing it as a watershed moment in post-war reconciliation. The reaction has been universally positive, Your Majesty, Sir Christopher reported. Editorial writers are describing your visit as demonstrating the continued relevance of monarchy in addressing moral challenges. The New York Times called it a masterclass in the power of symbolic leadership. The Queen nodded thoughtfully. She had never visited Bergen-Belsen for international acclaim or diplomatic advantage. She had gone because it was the right thing to do, because the victims deserved to be honored, and because the survivors needed to know their suffering had not been forgotten. But she was pleased that the visit's larger messages about tolerance, remembrance, and reconciliation were being understood. In Frankfurt, the Queen's first engagement was with young people participating in exchange programs between Britain and Germany. These students, many of them the same age she had been during World War II, represented the future that had emerged from the reconciliation their grandparents had achieved. The meeting took place at the historic Paulskirche, where Germany's first democratically elected parliament had convened in 1848. The symbolism was deliberate. This was a place associated with democracy, freedom, and the German people's long struggle for self-determination. It provided the perfect backdrop for a conversation about the future. The students had prepared thoughtful questions about the Queen's visit to Bergen-Belsen and what it meant for their generation. One young German student asked how they could honor the memory of Holocaust victims while also moving forward without being paralyzed by guilt for crimes they had not committed. The Queen's response demonstrated the wisdom gained from decades of experience and the previous day's emotional journey. You honor the victims by learning their stories, by understanding how hatred can grow when good people remain silent, and by committing yourselves to building a world where such evil cannot take root. You are not responsible for the crimes of the past, but you are responsible for ensuring they are not repeated. A British student asked about the role of forgiveness in international relations. How had Britain and Germany managed to transform their relationship so completely after such devastating conflict? Forgiveness, the Queen replied, is not about forgetting or excusing terrible actions. It is about choosing to build something better rather than remaining trapped by past grievances. The friendship between our countries was built on honesty about what had happened, justice for those who had suffered, and a shared commitment to preventing such tragedies from occurring again. The conversation continued for over an hour, with students asking about everything from European unity to the role of young people in preventing extremism. The Queen's responses drew heavily on what she had learned from the Holocaust survivors of Bergen-Belsen, their stories of resilience serving as powerful examples of hope triumphing over despair. Following the student meeting, the Queen addressed a gathering of business leaders from both countries. Her speech focused on economic cooperation, but it was clear that the previous day's visit had influenced her thinking about the broader relationship between Britain and Germany. Our economic partnership, she observed, is built on something more solid than mere commercial advantage. It is founded on shared values, mutual respect, and the understanding that we are stronger together than apart. The horrors of the past remind us how precious these bonds are and how carefully they must be nurtured. The business leaders responded with sustained applause, understanding that they were hearing something more than the usual diplomatic platitudes. The Queen's words carried the weight of genuine emotion and hard-earned wisdom about the value of international cooperation. Chancellor Merkel, who had accompanied the Queen throughout the German visit, used her own speech to the business gathering to reflect on the broader significance of the royal tour. Your Majesty's visit, and particularly your courage in going to Bergen-Belsen, reminds us that leadership sometimes means doing difficult things not because they are politically expedient, but because they are morally necessary. The final formal event of the visit was a reception at the British consulate in Frankfurt, bringing together members of the British community in Germany along with their German friends and colleagues. The gathering provided a microcosm of how completely the relationship between the two countries had been transformed. Among the guests were elderly British expatriates who had moved to Germany in the post-war years, helping to rebuild the country and forge new relationships. There were also young professionals working for international companies, representing the seamless economic integration that had developed between the two nations. Several Holocaust survivors living in Germany had been invited to the reception, providing an opportunity for the Queen to continue conversations begun at Bergen-Belsen. Their presence served as a reminder that the previous day's visit was not just a historical ceremony, but part of an ongoing commitment to remembrance and education. One survivor, Dr. Ruth Weiss, had emigrated to Britain after the war, but had later returned to Germany to work on Holocaust education programs. She spoke with the Queen about the importance of teaching young Germans about this history. Your Majesty's visit yesterday will be remembered by school children who weren't even born when I was in the camps, she observed. That is how memory is preserved, through the willingness of leaders to confront difficult truths. As the reception wound down, the Queen took time for private conversations with various guests. Each interaction reinforced the central themes of her visit: the importance of remembrance, the power of reconciliation, and the responsibility each generation bears for building a better future. The departure from Frankfurt Airport was markedly different from the arrival in Berlin 4 days earlier. Where the initial atmosphere had been formal and somewhat tentative, the farewell was warm and emotional. German officials, journalists, and ordinary citizens who had followed the visit understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. President Gauck's farewell speech captured the mood perfectly. Your Majesty, you came to our country as a friend, but you leave as something more, as someone who has shown us the courage to face our history honestly and the wisdom to transform past sorrows into future hope. Your visit to Bergen-Belsen will be remembered as long as people value truth, justice, and human dignity. The Queen's final words on German soil were characteristically measured but deeply felt. We leave Germany with profound gratitude for your hospitality and deep respect for your commitment to confronting the past honestly while building a better future. The friendship between our nations, forged through decades of patient work and mutual understanding, stands as proof that even the deepest wounds can heal when people of good will choose reconciliation over revenge. The flight back to London provided time to process what had been accomplished during the 4-day visit. The Queen reviewed newspaper coverage from around the world, all emphasizing the historic nature of her visit to Bergen-Belsen and its significance for post-war reconciliation. Editorial writers were already describing the visit as one of the most important royal tours in modern history. But Perhaps the most meaningful response came from ordinary people. Letters and messages were pouring in from Holocaust survivors, their children and grandchildren, young Germans who had watched the visit with pride in their country's democratic transformation, and British citizens who felt their monarch had represented the best values of their nation. As the royal aircraft touched down at RAF Nordholt, the Queen could see crowds gathered despite the security restrictions. News of her return had spread, and Londoners wanted to welcome her home from what many recognized as a mission of extraordinary moral importance. The drive back to Buckingham Palace provided a chance to reflect on the visit's lasting significance. The Queen had not only completed a successful state visit, but had participated in an act of historical reconciliation that would be remembered for generations. Her willingness to visit Bergen-Belsen had demonstrated the continued relevance of monarchy in addressing humanity's greatest moral challenges. In the days that followed, the impact of the visit continued to reverberate. Educational programs about the Holocaust reported increased interest from schools. Museums documenting the period saw rising visitor numbers. Most importantly, conversations about tolerance, remembrance, and the responsibility to stand against hatred became more prominent in public discourse. The Queen's fifth state visit to Germany had achieved something far more significant than improved diplomatic relations or enhanced trade agreements. It had demonstrated the power of moral leadership, the importance of confronting difficult history, and the extraordinary human capacity for forgiveness and reconciliation. Holocaust survivors around the world spoke of feeling validated by the Queen's visit to Bergen-Belsen. Their suffering had been acknowledged at the highest levels of international society. Their stories had been honored, and their message about the importance of remembrance had been amplified to a global audience. The visit also had a profound impact on British-German relations for years to come. The image of the Queen standing in respectful silence at the Bergen-Belsen Memorial became an enduring symbol of how nations could acknowledge past wrongs while building future partnerships. It provided a model for other countries struggling to address difficult aspects of their own histories. Most importantly, the visit reinforced the essential lesson that tolerance and understanding must be actively cultivated and constantly defended. The Queen's journey to Bergen-Belsen reminded the world that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against hatred, and that each generation must choose anew whether to build bridges or walls between peoples. As the Queen settled back into her routine at Buckingham Palace, she carried with her the knowledge that she had participated in something truly historic. The visit to Germany, and particularly to Bergen-Belsen, had demonstrated that even in the 21st century, there remained a vital role for moral leadership in confronting humanity's greatest challenges. The friendship between Britain and Germany, forged through decades of patient work and mutual understanding, had been strengthened and deepened by her willingness to stand on sacred ground and bear witness to both humanity's capacity for evil and its even greater capacity for redemption. It was a legacy that would endure long after the ceremonial aspects of the state visit were forgotten, a testament to the enduring power of courage, compassion, and the determination to ensure that history's darkest chapters would never be repeated.